What's up, guys? Coach Steve here, and welcome to Understanding Nutrition. We're going part 2, our macronutrients. In part 1, we talked about energy balance and how energy balance is the biggest factor when it comes to changing our body composition. Now we're going to talk about our energy our macronutrients in a little bit more detail. Then we're going to talk about our nutritional timing, then our food composition, how to adjust your diet, and then finishing up on nutritional periodization. So our macronutrients, we've got our proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and then our ethanol, which is alcohol. So we're mainly going to be touching on our protein, carbs, and fats today so that you get a better understanding about our macros and understanding about what is our minimum requirements, what are our maximum requirements, and then how much of each we should be getting. Let's start with our protein. So the protein is our building blocks for bodily tissues and influences most of our bodily functions. So what that means is that proteins make up almost every cell in our body. So it makes our skin, our hair, and of course, our good old muscle, skeletal muscle. So we need protein for our body tissues and to maintain our bodily tissues. It also plays an important role in most bodily functions. So I'm talking about brain function, I'm talking about our immune system, our digestive system. Our body requires protein for most functions. Protein has about 4 calories per gram of protein. Now, remember that if you were to have, let's say, 100 grams of a source of chicken, most of us know that chicken is protein. Chicken itself isn't, if you had 100 grams of chicken, that doesn't equal 100 grams of protein, okay? So about 100 grams of chicken is about, 20, 25 grams of protein. There is that difference between how much the food weighs versus how many actual macronutrients are in that food. It has a high thermic effect. Now, thermic effect is our thermic effect of food and about how it digests in our body. So protein has a thermic effect of about 20 to 30%, depending on what source you look at. So that means about a quarter of our protein intake gets used just to break down that protein. So if we were having 4 calories per gram of protein, we lose about a calorie. So we lose a calorie per gram just to digest protein. So we end up only really having about 3 grams of 3 calories per gram of protein when we're consuming protein. So high thermic effect, which is why high protein diets are so successful for weight loss. Talking about proteins and amino acids, you might have heard of this word before. Essentially, a protein can be broken down into a peptide, which can be further broken down into amino acids. Now, our body uses amino acids, so it doesn't necessarily use the protein. It breaks the protein down into smaller little bits, and it uses the amino acids. And then these little amino acids are kind of like little Lego pieces, and they use for very specific jobs. So maybe this orange little amino acid goes to our hair, and then this green amino acid goes to form our nails, and then maybe this red amino acid, because it's red, it goes to our muscle. Okay, so this is just an example about where they kind of go. Our amino acids, there's 20 common amino acids, and we can see them just here. And there might be some names that you might be familiar with, such as our BCAAs, our isoleucine, leucine, and valine. So BCAAs, meaning our branched chain amino acids, which are closely linked to muscle growth, these 3 here. We can divide them up into essential amino acids, meaning that our body needs them from food sources. Non-essential amino acids, meaning that these are amino acids that our body can make itself and thrive and totally fine. We don't need these non-essential amino acids. And then conditionally essential amino acids. So our body may need increased demands of these amino acids depending on the situation you're in. Maybe if you're under stress, if you've been training, if you're pregnant, you might need more of these amino acids. And they include things like our glutamine, where they're not super essential right now, but as we introduce training, we benefit from increasing those amino acids. Some protein sources, like we said, we've got most animal products like our chicken. We've got things like our dairy products and eggs. Lots of plant products, such as our soy, tofu, grains high in protein. And then most vegetables have some sort of protein in them. So I'm talking about our good friends broccoli and lots of things like tomatoes and carrots. All the good things have some sort of protein in them because that's what actually builds the cells of a vegetable is protein. Let's talk about muscle protein synthesis versus muscle protein breakdown, or MPS, we call it, or MPB, muscle build or muscle breakdown. Now we call this kind of anabolism and then catabolism. So anabolism is the state of building and then catabolism is the state of breakdown. Now our body goes through these natural cycles of muscle building and muscle breakdown throughout the day, which is why we prefer to have protein spaced out throughout the day, and preferably we want to have at least 4 boluses of protein, a bolus meaning a serve of protein. Now, if we were to have all of our protein at once, we kind of spend a lot of time in this kind of muscle protein breakdown. So we do need this continuous supply of protein throughout the whole day. Protein requirements. For the general population, average Joe, we want about 1 gram per kilo of body weight. For the athletic population, maybe like you and I, we're training, we want to be aiming for about 2 grams per kilo of body weight. It's best not to exceed 3 grams per kilo of body weight, mainly because we have some challenges with gastric distress. Remember that it has a high thermic effect. It takes lots of energy and effort to break down. That means it spends longer time in our digestive system, so that can lead to bloating, some nausea, and these types of symptoms when we have higher protein intakes. Underconsumption has some side effects such as poor tissue recovery or fatigue or just overall being unwell or really hungry. You may be experiencing these such as fatigue and tiredness and hunger, which leads to more consumption of food, which may be the reason why we are not happy with our body composition at the moment, because many Westerners have a low protein intake, maybe around this 1 gram or lower, while we're trying to do some sort of athletic training, such as, going to the gym. Let's talk about carbohydrates. So our body breaks down carbohydrates in the following priority. So we've got our carbohydrate, it breaks it down, and firstly, it's going to go to cells that need it right now and need it for energy. So our cells, such as our cells in our brain, cells in our muscles, cells in our heart, and all the bits and pieces. Then parts of our carbohydrate will be circulated in the blood to be used from needy cells. Needy cells like our neuronal cells. So these cells are really love our glucose and our carbohydrates. We need some level of blood sugar level or our blood glucose levels so that we can supply energy to these cells. Then once all of our cells are kind of like, okay, chill, everyone's fine, then we get to store some of our carbohydrate as glycogen in our liver, firstly, and then we get to store glycogen in our skeletal muscle. So as a super summary, we've got our carbohydrate, and then it gets broken down to glucose or sugar, so a sugar molecule, and our body loves to use glucose for energy. So we want to be giving our body as much energy as we can, and we want to use that energy to fuel our training sessions. We want to fuel our lives. We want to fuel our brain function and basically nourish our body with as much energy as we can. A carbohydrate is about 4 calories per gram and slightly lower thermic effect at about 5-10%. So a little bit lower than protein, which means that our body is a little bit better at breaking down a carbohydrate to use as energy. Here's a little bit of a diagram depicting our type of carbohydrates. So carbohydrate and sugar, our smallest molecule of carbohydrate is a monosaccharide, meaning 1 sugar molecule. We've got disaccharides too. Then we have a few other polysaccharides. So these are like things like our complex carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates. And basically our body loves to use these small molecules, really easy, enters the cells, happy days, party in the cell. But then some of these bigger carbohydrates a little bit longer to break down in our body, which can help with things like our hunger levels, satiety levels, but then it decreases the time, or increases the time it takes for that energy to enter the cell so that we can actually use that energy. We've got some types of carbohydrates. So we've got our good friend glucose here, monosaccharides. We've got things like lactose you might be familiar with, and things like starches here, polysaccharides. Talking about fiber, fiber is classified under our carbohydrates. So if you go back to this image here, we've got fiber just there. And then things like cellulose is a type of fiber. And it is a non-digestible, non-starch polysaccharide. So when you consume fiber that is within a carbohydrate, our body doesn't actually digest it. It just kind of goes through our digestive system, makes up our foliage, and makes up our feces, right? And it's divided into 2 areas. We've got our soluble fiber, which dissolves in water, and then insoluble fiber, which does not dissolve in water. So soluble fiber dissolving in water means that it adds to our our poop, and then insoluble fiber does not dissolve into our water, so that it increases the size of our poop. Okay, but then depending on your gut bacteria, some individuals can digest certain types of fibers, where others have a little bit of a harder time to digest some sort of fibers. The different sources of carbohydrates. First and foremost, we get most of our carbs from fruits and vegetables. Of course, a grain is a type of vegetable because we grow it as a plant. So a lot of our carbohydrates come from fruits and vegetables, pastas, rice, bread, cereals, these types of things. You can find carbohydrates in nuts and seeds, and then also in dairy products. So things like our milk is really high in sugar, and we can find that in our cheese, our yogurts and such. Carbohydrate requirements. Well, there is actually no minimum requirement for carbohydrates. So firstly, probably the big one is fiber. Within our carbohydrates, we want to have a minimum amount of fiber. Aiming for about 25 grams per day for adults is probably a good number to aim for. If you're having less than 10 grams per day, okay, you probably face some challenges from your fiber intake. And then if you're having more than 50 grams, you might be facing some challenges with that fiber intake. So, 50 grams plus, things like our constipation, less than 10 grams per day, things like diarrhea. Okay. Talking about our net carbohydrate requirements. So, our total carbs minus our fiber equals our net, and there's no minimum. However, what we want to do is actually maximize the most amount of carbohydrates that we possibly can, so that we get our, minimum requirements of protein, we get our minimum requirements of fat, then we get as much carbohydrate as we can so that we can fuel our training and we can promote and if we can fuel our training, that means we can train harder. And then if we're training harder, we're stimulating more muscle growth. So this is a conversation around body composition. How can we get the most out of our training? Talking about fats. So fats are categorized under a lipid, different types of lipids in our body. It's the most important hormone for hormone production and vitamin absorption. So we need fats to absorb vitamins, and we also need it to create hormones in our body. Much higher in calories per gram, which is why low-fat diets are quite successful, because we're just consuming less calories per gram. So we're able to consume more food, but then have a lot less energy-dense foods. It has quite a low thermic effect, meaning our body utilizes that fat energy really easily. We can access it really quickly. This is just an image showing our different types of lipids in our body. So we are mainly looking at our fat, triglycerides, and then consumed fat and stored fats. Okay, so we're mainly looking at this consumed fat. Now, our triglyceride is stored as a glycerol, and then we're looking at our fatty acids. So this is going to make sense in a moment, but we consume fatty acids, our body stores it as a triglyceride, and then our triglycerides either float around our bloodstream or eventually go towards our stored fats. Here we can see a little bit of an overview about different types of fatty acids. So of course, we've got saturated fatty acids. We can find that in our beef, butter, coconut oil, and our saturated fatty acids don't really add anything to us. They're kind of like not good, not bad. They're just there. Okay, we don't really want to be having too many saturated fatty acids, but we're not super concerned about consuming fatty acids. Don't be afraid of saturated fatty acids. These trans fats, okay, a little bit more problematic. We find them in things like our margarines and puff pastries and these foods that we love eating. They're higher in trans fats. We do want to kind of avoid high intakes of trans fats because they are linked to heart disease. Here we've got our monosaturated fats, where we can find them in things like our olive oil, and then polyunsaturated fats. So monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. So these are kind of like our good fats. Remember, even though it's a good fat, it's still a source of energy. So be careful if you are going to just add good fats to your meal, because you may think that it, promotes fat loss in some way. You're just going to be adding more calories to your day, which will negate any body changes that you're trying to make. Fat sources, of course, we've got lots from animal products. Things like cholesterol is made within our body, and then in animals, their body makes their own cholesterol. And if we're consuming cholesterol, that's how we get heightened levels of cholesterol. So we do know that we get fat sources from animals. We do get a lot from dairy, and then some plant sources as well, things like our nuts, seeds, avocados, tofus, and oils and such. Fat requirements, we do need a minimum of about 0.6 grams per kilo of body weight. That's the minimum. A good number to aim for is maybe that 0.8 grams as kind of a target to aim for. Let's talk about the calorie constraint hypothesis. So calories must be manipulated to fit within the energy demands. So what this means is that we have a certain amount of calories that we want to allocate to a certain day. So let's say 2,000 calories for a day. When it comes to our actual macronutrients prescription, our ratios, it doesn't really matter what our ratios are as long as it fits within our calorie constraint model. And this is mainly for our changes in body composition. It doesn't matter what our ratios are. Of course, there are a level of optimization that we could follow. So what my suggestion for you is to aim for this 2 grams per kilo of body weight of our our protein intake, 2 grams per kilo of body weight. Step 1. Step 2, we want to work out our minimum fat intake. So at least 0.6 grams of fat. And then the rest can be made up by calories. So that's one way that we can approach our macronutrient ratios. And this would be somewhat of a more optimal way to approach it because we are biasing a lot of our energy towards carbohydrates so that we can stimulate and fuel our training sessions so that we can grow muscle. Ultimately, the ratio between carbs and fats will come down to your own preference. It doesn't matter if you choose to go high fat or high carb or low carb. As long as we're hitting these protein targets and fitting within these calorie constraint models, we can see some really great changes in our body composition. Here is a bit of a case study about how we can calculate our macros. So let's say you were a 75 kilo individual who were moderately active, and let's say you were requiring 2,500 calories to stay at maintenance body weight. So you're not changing. To work out protein, we've got 75, which would be our weight, times 2, so 150 grams. That would be about 600 calories. Then we've got our fats, so 75 times 0.6, so that's 405 calories or 45 grams of fats. And then carbohydrates were making up the rest. So we've got this number here, which is our maintenance, minus our protein calories and our fats calories, which equals 1495. 1495 divided by 4 is about 375 grams or that 1,495. So our ratio would be protein, carbs, fats, 24, 60, and 16. But look, realistically, these numbers are really difficult to nail on the head. Okay, the difference between calories, we have to add in the conversation of how much you're actually absorbing, how much are you consuming, are you chewing the food, and then of course, are you weighing the food correctly, and then are the food composition completely correct in what food you're eating. So some of these targets may be off, and we need to allow for some level of error and some level of variance. So if you were aiming for like plus or minus 10% on this number, plus or minus 10% of these numbers, great way to start our weight loss journey. I don't think anyone could be absolutely 100% perfect every single time. We do need to allow for some variation in these numbers. The main takeaways here is that we want proteins for our tissue maintenance and growth, and they're about 4 calories per gram. Carbohydrate, 4 calories per gram, most important for energy. Fats are really important for hormone production and the vitamin absorption. That's about 9 calories per gram. And then for body composition goals, and macronutrients must fit within the calorie constraint hypothesis. So that's our macronutrients, and join me next time where we're talking about food composition.